So, welcome everyone to the Integrated Wellbeing program today for people in grief and the professionals who serve them. We're here to shatter the stigma of suicide by interviewing those bereaved by suicide, mental health professionals, and grief specialists. Because at Integrated Wellbeing Institute, our mission is to awaken the griever to their inner peace through the guidance of their body. And I am very grateful today to welcome our very first guest, Paula Fontenelle. Hello, Paula.
Hello. Hi, Georgena. I'm so honored to be the first. Thank you.
Oh, you were the perfect choice because you've been the inspiration for so many things in my life. Paula was a journalist and published author in Brazil when her father took his life in 2005. And her search for meaning in the face of this tragedy led her to make a radical career change. Today, she's a psychotherapist with a master's degree in clinical mental health and a deep dedication to reducing the cultural stigma surrounding suicide. Paula is the author of Understanding Suicide, Living with Loss, Paths to Prevention. And this book was a finalist for the Brazilian National Book Prize. She also is the host of the podcast and YouTube channel, Understand Suicide, where she interviews individuals touched by suicide, mental health professionals, and specialists. So, Paula, it's just so great to have you here today because you've lived through that tragedy of suicide. So tell us where you were living when your father died of suicide.
Yeah, so I was living in Recife, that's where I'm from. It's northeast of Brazil. And at the time, Georgena, even when I look back now, because as you know, there's so much secrecy surrounding suicide. Sometimes people around you have died of suicide and you don't even know. But even now, when I look back, I don't think there was anybody in my life, not in my family, not friends and acquaintances that had died of suicide. So suicide was this thing that only happens in movies and to others. So it was very, very distant from my life. So when it happened to my dad, as you know, I mean, it baffles you. It leaves you with so many, many questions. But to me, it was the unknown. And the way that I deal with the unknown, and it's different for everyone, is I dive into it. I have to understand. And I think that's one of the reasons why I chose my first profession to be a journalist, because we're always studying, learning new things. And I've always been very curious about so many different things. But suicide, when it happened, I just decided, okay, I need to understand, because it was just this huge question mark in my mind and in my heart. So I was in my 40s at the time, or late 30s maybe. I don't know, I'm not good with that. But anyway, so when he died, this is where I was. I mean, I knew that he was struggling. He was struggling financially at the time. One of those situations, a man, he was 68. So he had retired. He had just opened a new business, didn't work out. He was in a new relationship that I think at the time he was questioning if that was the best decision he had made. So a lot of struggle in his life. So I knew he was struggling, but never, ever did it cross my mind that he would think about something like that. So even though now when I look back now, I see he is one of those cases, Georgena, that all the warning signs were there. I mean, all of them. Now that I know, I just tick them all. But at the time, it was a huge surprise for all of us, even though it wasn't something, it wasn't expected, even though we knew what he was going through at the time.
Yeah. Tell our listeners today, please, of 3 or 4 of those signs that you would tick off.
Yeah. So as you know, some of these signs we can associate. If you look at like the symptoms of depression, you know that many of those signs can be one of the signs of depression. But as I usually say, and when I talk about these warning signs, they're the red flags, right? Even the red flags, he had them also. For example, you start getting rid of all your possessions. He did that. Even his collections, he was getting rid of them.
Wow.
The other red flag was that you start contacting friends and family members to say goodbye. He had been calling friends. That I only found out after, because I interviewed so many people from my book. But one of the things that he did, which is a red flag as well, as you know, is that he called me a few months before he died, and he asked me to give him like my documents because he wanted to have a shared account. So there is some of these things that you try to solve, all these things, financial, get everything in order. So the reason for that, now I know, was because then I would be able to take care of his money and to move it around and to do what he wanted. So all these warning signs were there, but no, I never even thought about it.
Well, and we talked earlier, you and I, about the fact that grief lives in the body. And I'm very curious, what was your experience of embodied grief, Paula?
Yeah. I love that you bring it up, Georgena, because I had no idea. And I think even now, we talk about depression more often. I mean, it's out there, especially after COVID, right? But we don't talk about the physical symptoms of depression. People talk about withdrawing. People become more into themselves, and they may look disheveled, or their emotions look this way or another. But we don't talk about the physical part enough, I believe, because at the time, I didn't even know, because what happened was, after he died, I decided to just dive into it. And I bought all these books. I was studying about suicide, reading case studies, reading books about suicidal, the suicidal mind, or Edwin Schneidman, which was my huge inspiration. And we can talk about him later on. So I was like, and as you know, when we do that, it was very important to me and very helpful to me to have the information. And that's why I dedicate my life to that now. But at the same time, I was reliving his loss over and over again. And of course, a year later, after reading, 20 books, and I had already decided to write my own book with the story, and I was interviewing people about him to understand more about my dad. And I started having all the symptoms of depression. But thankfully, because I was studying that, I was paying attention to my body, and I was paying attention to, for example, the day that I remember that I said, okay, there is something really wrong with me, I need to see a psychiatrist, was, I've always loved traveling. And one day I had a friend of mine who was waiting for me in New York, and I was supposed to come for 10 days to spend 10 days with him. And I got on my computer. I didn't know, when you do the search, Recife, New York, and all those options, they show up and they pop up on your screen. And I could not make sense of it. I would look, and I started to feel overwhelmed, like having like an anxiety attack. And I cannot buy this ticket. And that was the day when I said, no. It's too much. But of course, there were many other signs before. I remember one day, very specific one, that I was in a bar with friends having fun. And then it was like out of the blue, I would have these bouts of crying. I would get so sad from, of course, I say out of nowhere, but we know it is, and that's how grief works.
Yes.
But I would look around and say, why am I feeling this? I'm with my friends in a bar having fun. Why am I feeling like I need to run out of here and just cry? And same thing, I finally went to New York. Every night I would cry. I would put on a mask for my friend during the day, and at night I just couldn't wait to go to my room and cry. So all of these symptoms were there, and I identified those, but the physical ones I didn't know. So when I finally went to see a psychiatrist, and he asked, a battery of questions, And he said, are you feeling anything physical? And I said, well, I've been feeling a lot of back pain, but it's got nothing to do with depression. That's what I thought, right? Said, no, I actually had bought a new mattress, changed my mattress. I had done everything, went to the doctor, nothing was wrong. And he said, don't worry about it. And I remember the statistics he gave me then, because I don't know what it is now, but back then he told me 75% of people with depression will feel some kind of pain. And that really baffled me at the time. I said, really? Like physical pain? I did not. I thought it was, it's all in your head, right? Because that's what we hear. It's all in your head. So it's about emotions. It's about your mood, how you feel, but not the body. So I remember, and that was the magical thing about the medication at the time. He gave me a very low dose medication. And I'm telling you, Georgena, the mood took a little longer, but 2 days after I started taking the medication, I had no more back pain.
How amazing is that?
Wasn't that, it was really fast. I know that's not even usual for that kind of medication, but that's what startled me at the time. I said, wow, my back pain is gone. And it really stuck to me. So why don't we talk about this physical thing when you talk about grief and depression, right? So that's my experience.
Well, and as a trained somatic therapist, I then would say to you, the metaphor is who or what is the pain in your back? And it was the grief. And then as soon as you see how I'm leaning back, as soon as you got the support then of the medication, the pain went away like that. And the body tells the truth. The mind will lie. And so thank heavens you had the awareness and a wonderful psychiatrist who looked at all of grief, because it's physical, cognitive, the emotional, and the behavioral.
He was fantastic. I was very lucky.
Well, you're fantastic in that I was amazed to realize that you published your book in 2008. So 3 years after your father had passed, here's this book. And isn't it the first book in Portuguese that was published on suicide?
Yeah, and that was the thing too, that's actually what made me decide to write the book, because at the time I looked around, I could find nothing. And thankfully I speak English, so I said, I'll just buy my books in the US. From the US, I bought book from the US, and the countries that are more advanced in terms of suicide prevention, so US, Australia, UK, and I bought all these books from abroad. But then I looked around and said, this is ridiculous. I can't find a thing in Portuguese. I'm going to write it. So that's what actually made me decide, was I have to fill this gap, because there are so many people going through what I'm going through, and there's nothing for them. There's nothing. So it's still, to this day, it's still like a reference in my country, because it was the first. Even the mental health professionals, everybody knows my name, because they all read it when they have to do suicide training, because it was the first. And I'm very proud of that, because it was hard. I had to stop 3 times first.
Did you really?
Oh yeah. It was.
And then when you stopped, then how long was the stop, Paula?
Yeah, it depended. The first time I stopped was when I realized that I had depression, and I started the medication, because I knew that I had overdone it. So no, I have to take care of myself. Yes. Maybe I'll go back to that, and I didn't even know. So I took maybe 2 months off, and then I said, no, there is a huge gap. I have to write this book. I took it really as my mission. Yes. So I said, okay, I'll do it, and I went again, and because I would interview clinicians, all the authors that I read, I interviewed them all. And I started interviewing people who were suicidal, because the book talks about suicide and grief, but it talks from the perspective of both. Yes. Yeah, so I interviewed a lot, and then again, I would start feeling overwhelmed again. I would just respect it. I learned, that's one thing I learned from that. I learned how to respect my own body and myself. So I would stop and take a break, and for a couple of more months. So 3 years later, it was finally published in 2008. But it was hard.
Yes. And thank you for listening to yourself, because when each of us realizes that this is not something to push through, but rather a call for care. And when we listen deeply to ourselves, there's a richness there that comes into our lives. And then I was so excited. We met when you were creating your second edition.
Yes.
So tell us how that came about and the why behind that, please, Paula.
The second edition was because I wanted to reach more people. I mean, with Portuguese, there is a limitation, right? It's not a small limitation, because we have, 200 something million people in Brazil and Mozambique and Portugal. So they all speak Portuguese. But I moved here in end of 2006 to the US to get my master's, because I'm certified in my country in psychoanalysis. That was my original training. But I decided that very early on that psychoanalysis wasn't enough. I wanted to specialize in trauma. So I came here for my master's in clinical mental health. And as soon as I got here, I said, I have to publish a new edition. It was time for a new edition. And said, it has to be in English. So I translated, but there are many changes, and I have an added chapter in the new edition, and it's in English because now I can reach many more people. And also I decided to have the podcast, the YouTube channel, so it all comes together. And I'm really happy that I did that, because the podcast today has listeners from over 150 countries. So I would never do that if I had stuck to Portuguese.
And I'm so excited for our listeners to know what the ranking is on your podcast. So give us a little history on that, Paula.
You should do that, not me. It sounds bad when it's me promoting myself.
Okay, then anyway. I will. So when Paula began, she had a small group of listeners. Then the podcast became in the top 5%. Before Christmas, it was in the top 3%. And now it's in the top 2% of all the podcasts in the world. Did I get it?
Yes.
I think that's just remarkable. And what that says to me, Paula, is that says your podcast is called Understand Suicide. So there is this hunger for people to understand what has happened. And you alluded to your mentor earlier, and he had such stellar guidance. But would you share the two things he said, please?
Yes. Also, it's hard to choose what he said, but I think I know what you're talking about. So his name is Dr. Edwin Schneidman. He was American. I was so lucky, Georgena, that I got to interview him, because he is well known for being the father of suicidology, so the study of suicide. He was the first one. He opened the first suicide prevention center in LA. So that when I interviewed, he was turning 90. And I know because he told me that week he was going to turn 90 years old. And he was such an example. He was so humble. The phone call that I was trying to find him, and because of the time difference, I remember I had to rush home during my lunchtime. It was like 7 hours difference. So that was the only window I had. And I rushed home and I called the only number that I found online somehow. I thought it was the university. So I called and I said, this person answers. Hi, my name is Paula. I'm a journalist from Brazil, trying to contact Dr. Edwin Schneidman. And there's this silence on the other side. And he goes, why would you want to talk to me from Brazil? And I went, Dr. Edwin, is that you? And he said, yeah, why would you want to talk to me? And I explained to him, I'm writing the book, and his was my first book. And it's still, I think, one of the most important books on suicide. It's called The Suicidal Mind. And I said, listen, I read all your books, and I would love to interview you. And he said, when would that be good for you? And I said, I don't know. How about Thursday? This was like a Monday. Can you do it Thursday? And he said, you know what, Paula, how about now? So I said, of course. And I got it wasn't Zoom or anything. I got my recorder. It was like one of those little digital recorders.
I remember those.
I put it on speakerphone and I interviewed him. And he was one of the most amazing people, so humble, just a lovely man. And I learned so much from them. And one of the things that he says that I repeat all the time, because I think it's absolutely so simple and absolutely genius. It has to come from someone who is sensitive like he was. And he says, there are only two questions you ask a suicidal person. The first one is, where does it hurt? And the second is, how can I help? And it's so simple. And that's what it is, isn't it? That's all you need to do.
Genius is always simple.
Yeah.
And then what I heard are those pauses of presence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what is hard sometimes about being with someone who's in that distressed state, for us to not fix, but to be present. And so they can feel that spinningness. We're here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And when I look back with my dad, I did that, even though it wasn't suicide related. But because I've always been interested in psychology. I always studied a lot. And I remember that at some point I sat down with my dad and I said, Dad, you need help. You need to see a psychiatrist. You're not doing okay. I had a hint that he had depression. I don't think you're doing okay. So let's find a doctor. And he was really good about it, especially for his generation. And being a man, as you know, emotions are not something we talk about when it comes to men. So he said, okay, I'll go. And we set up a date. He did go to the psychiatrist, and he was diagnosed with depression. Never took a pill, though. He never did the treatment, didn't go to therapy. I think it was too much for him. I mean, he took the first step, but he didn't.
He did.
Yeah.
Yes. And so for you to be able to look back and to know, I saw this, we had the conversation, he did go.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I've encountered so much personally, because of the death of my son, which was an impulsive death, not planned out like your father's at all. When Reed got up that morning, he did not intend to kill himself. He had failed a breathalyzer test, was kicked off the basketball team, and suspended from school for 3 days. And he was this very popular 9th grade kid that had never failed. And so he was so embarrassed he wanted to die. And that's exactly what happened. And the irony of the fact that we're talking today, it was 25 years ago today, Paula, that Reed died of suicide. So I'm so grateful that we can have this conversation, because things have changed so much. And yet there's still that stigma of suicide. So as a person that has written this marvelous book and a second edition, has worked with so many people, what is it that you can say? What would be the one thing that you would say to shatter the stigma of suicide?
Well, before I say that, Georgena, thank you so much for sharing this very meaningful day with me.
You're welcome.
I didn't know. I'm glad you mentioned, and I'm glad I'm part of this day with you, because, the other thing that Edwin Schneidman taught me was that part for a suicidal mind, half of it is the pain, and the other half is being alone with the pain. So I'm glad that you're not alone today, that we're sharing this day for you. So,
thank you.
So the stigma. Yeah, that's our fight, huh? Our mission.
It is. We're here to shatter that stigma.
Well, I do believe in the power of knowledge. So first of all, the first thing I can say for those of you who are listening, say, well, I think suicide is just selfish, because that's one of the things we hear, right? Please read from the perspective of those who are in pain. So that's the main thing. And that's one thing I do on my podcast very often, is to listen to people who attempted suicide and learn something from it and what helps them. But mainly is to know for those like that who have some kind of judgment about it, and not only that, but for those who lost a loved one to suicide, to understand what they go through when they reach that limit and that day, right? You were mentioning your son, it was impulsive, but as we know, that's rare. Suicide, many times when you look back, you can see signs, you can see things that there was kind of a progression, or there is a history of attempts or mental health issues. It's rare that it's impulsive. But I want those of you who are listening to please come from a place of compassion, understanding, and forgiveness, because they need. Sometimes you need to forgive, especially those who are struggling with grief, right? Try to understand where they were, where is the pain, right? Yes. So I think that's a first step. It helped me a lot, and that's why I believe in it. That's why I have all this content out there, the website, the book, the podcast, the YouTube, because so many times I hear people, they contact me and say, wow, if only I had known, I wouldn't have judged, and I wouldn't have. The other thing that we hear a lot is, oh, they just want attention. If I had known that was not just, they want just attention, especially from like teenagers and stuff. So try to understand and put yourself, exercise empathy, put yourself in their place, and try to understand how they're seeing their lives. And also, of course, extend your hand and offer help. Knowing that there are limitations, of course, it's not that you're responsible for somebody's life, but you can save it. So many times we can, with many simple things, just asking the question, are you okay? Are you thinking about suicide? Don't be afraid to use the word. That's a myth that we have, that if you use the word, you're going to put the idea in their heads. No, we know from research, and we know from so many, I know from hundreds of interviews, I'm sure you know that too, Georgena, that instead of putting the idea in their heads, you liberate them to talk about it.
Absolutely.
You open it up. It's a door that you open, and they finally say, wow, I can't believe someone is ready to listen, because many times that's all they need.
Because
it's a big step.
I feel so alone.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things with Reed, is when he was upset, you left him alone. So his dad was talking to the basketball coach. I was comforting his girlfriend. And he told his buddies, I'll see you on the basketball floor next year. But something snapped in that running home, that mile in the bitter cold. We don't know.
Yeah.
And so,
and that's the other thing too, right? And we might never know.
Exactly.
You might
Absolutely.
never know. And it's so tough to understand that, to come to the recognition that sometimes you just have to sit with the unknown.
That's right. We do. And before we go into grief, I'd like you to tell our listeners, please, about the course you have on your website, please, because it seems like this is the perfect time to talk about it.
Yes. So my course is called How to Help Suicidal People. So it goes through many of the things we're talking about. Of course, it talks about warning signs, but it talks about, for example, preparing for that conversation, because it's very easy to say, just ask the question. But before you do that, you have to prepare. So I have a whole module on how to get ready for that conversation. Good. So to check in with yourself, what are your views, your opinions, your biases about suicide? You have to take care of that first, because you don't want to ask the question and maybe they'll say, yeah, I'm thinking about suicide. And then you judge and you say something like, well, but don't do that. How can you do that to your family? We know that's not going to help. It's just going to shame them, and it's going to make matters worse. So it's not just about having like the courage or the openness to have the conversation. It's about taking care of yourself, getting rid of some of this judgment, but checking in and seeing, well, am I really the best person to have this conversation? And you might come to the conclusion that no, you can't. So find somebody else. Search for help and create that connection, right? So I go through many of these. There's a module on risk factors. What are the risk factors? What are the warning signs? And most importantly, 2 modules on how to help. So depending on where they are, and I teach you how kind of to gauge where they are, these are the interventions that you can do. And what are your limitations? For example, is it a case of calling a psychiatrist? Do they need medications? Do they not need a medication? Should I call 911 if it's imminent danger? So I go through all of that with them.
How wonderful. Thank you very much for creating this resource, because there are millions of people who are living with someone who is at risk for suicide. And we both know that knowledge is power. And so what you've done is you've created this wonderful tool. So thank you. And there will be a link to that below this.
Thank you.
So the other thing I know about you is that you have seen many grieving people bereaved by suicide. And I want to mention that Paula is one of the facilitators of the suicide bereavement group here in Portland, Oregon. We have one in Portland, and we have another that meets in person in Beaverton. And so our website is sbsnw.org. And these are peer support groups. And it's so wonderful that Paula and her colleague, Amy Frazier, volunteer to do this with people once a month at Peace House. So we'll put that link below too, because it's so mind-boggling for me, Paula, to see thousands of people turn up for the Out of the Darkness walk to raise money for suicide prevention. And the majority of the people that are walking have had someone die of suicide, and they could benefit from these support groups and aren't there. And what I know is it takes a great deal of courage to show up and be with people. So getting back to the fact that as therapists, we've had people come into our office and say, well, you're the third person I've come to.
Third? Those are the lucky ones.
Tell us more, Paula.
Well, I had the other day someone contact me from another state here in the US. I've had clients from like Germany. That's how hard it is for people to find a therapist who gets it, because this is what I heard from one of them. She said, Paula, I am so tired of therapists telling me they need to fix me. There's nothing broken in me. The problem is, and that's how I found you. She found you through the podcast and my website. And she said, I'm so glad I finally found you because you lost your dad. At least you get it. I need someone who gets it. But you don't have to. Here I'm talking to the therapist, right? I'm talking to you, my dear colleagues. You don't have to get it to be a grief counselor or a grief therapist and to understand about suicide. I mean, read about it. I just realized that I have an image here. And it's my crow. I love crows. They're my favorite birds. And look at that. He's reading a book. I mean,
He certainly is reading a book.
I really believe that knowledge is everything, and because all the other tools as a counselor or as a therapist you already have. You have the empathy, you have the compassion, the need, and the desire to help others. But please don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, and please don't use the word fix. You're not going to fix anything because there's nothing broken. But be open to that. I know it's hard. It's a heavy kind, let's say, heavy client to have for some people. I remember, Georgena, when I finished my clinical mental health, my master's, we had like a gathering of all the teachers, to celebrate with the students. And everybody would ask, oh, what are you going to do? What are you working on? What are your plans? And I would say, I want to work with grief. And even from my colleagues, they would go, wow, that's so heavy.
Taken aback.
So glad. Yeah. They go, you know how it is, right? Physically, they go, whoa.
Yes.
No, they keep a distance, right? So I don't want to go there.
Oh, I don't want to get that from you.
I'm not going there.
I don't want to catch grief.
Yeah, but here's what boggles me. Do therapists really believe that they're not going to see grief in their offices? Of course they will.
Yes, because loss is a part of life.
Loss is a part of life.
Is a natural consequence of loss. Of course they're going to see it.
Of course they're going to. So don't be afraid Don't be afraid. I mean, hold their grief and be open to that experience, because I'm telling you, it's the most beautiful experience one can have. It's painful, we know that, but it's transformative. That's where you see people change their lives. They focus on their values. They focus on their on gratitude for what they have. I mean, it needs time, but they realize what their priorities are.
Yes.
So it's a beautiful thing to witness. So that's what I have to say to my colleagues.
Yes. So did you hear what she said? Be present, be aware that there's nothing to fix.
Yeah.
Because we're a grief phobic culture.
Oh, yeah.
And so to simply be in the awareness that every person's grief is unique, and yet they know their way through. There's a tool I developed, Paula, over a decade ago called the Grief Awareness Assessment. And it's sections of what's happening to people. And in the diving deep questions, I ask, where does grief live in your body? What are you afraid of happening? What's working for your grief? What's not working? By answering those questions, people give us as therapists the way to companion them through grief.
Yeah.
And so it's very, very essential. I'm talking about the new paradigm of grief being actually, we're not broken by this loss. We're broken open like a seed to grow in self-awareness and new connections. Yeah. Because love never dies.
No, it doesn't. And the other thing that I'm thinking about, it's very important. It's in my course too. Please forget about the stages of grief. Don't bring it up. Do not bring it up. That was a mistake. It was a misunderstanding. That's not what Kubler-Ross meant at all. And it's not scientific. Nobody has to go through specific stages. Nothing is linear when it comes to grief. It's going to be different for everybody. And when we talk about suicide grief, and that's even more, unique. It's a very unique kind of grief. So things that, for example, sadness, people after a loss, let's say a car or disease, you feel sad for that loss. For us, many times the first thing we feel is anger. And for so many people, just other different types of grief, they'll never feel angry at them. They're a victim, right? Someone died of an illness or a homicide or accident. For us, there is so much anger many times. How could they do this to us? Right? How could they not think about me? And so there's so many peculiarities when it comes to suicide grief. Yes. So be open to that as a therapist, that it's not going to look forget this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you have to go through that, and then acceptance. Maybe you'll never accept it, and that's fine. Exactly. That's fine. It's your journey. It is. You have to respect that. And even, Georgena, I'm sure you say this in your office all the time, within the family, there will be different styles of grief. Oh, Paula, and when it comes to suicide, it's so hard, because I had the other day, someone called me from Brazil, and they was, Paula, you need to help me. I don't know what to do with my mother. And I said, why? What do you mean? So she lost her brother to suicide. So the mother, she doesn't believe it's suicide. She will not accept that it was suicide. How can I convince her? I said, you don't have to convince her. No. Your grief that's where your grief is. Your brother died of suicide. Your mom, for her, it's way too hard. That's right. And for now, she's not, respect it. Don't try to convince her of anything. No. It's going to just keep yourself distant from your mom. So don't do that. Just sit with her where she is. If that's what she believes in right now, maybe deep inside she doesn't, and maybe one day she will realize that that's what happened, and maybe not, and that's fine. That's her journey. So suicide, when it's suicide grieving within families, it can be such a huge source of conflict, right? Yes. The blaming, how many times we hear that. I have one of my episodes, I interviewed a wonderful man who did it for like decades, suicide grief, and we talked about how to deal with the blame, because you are going to be blamed many times, right? Especially if it's the parent. I mean, how could you not protect your kid?
Yes,
right?
Exactly. You failed as a parent.
You failed as a parent, so there is self-blame, but there's blame from others too.
Yes.
So there's so many things, so many peculiarities when it comes to suicide. So for therapists, just know that there are differences. And how can you know? Please study. There is so much information out there now. There's no more excuse to not know, right?
No, there is no more excuse. And my grief was very different than yours in that I was never angry with Reed. I realized he snapped like a reed in the wind. And for me, it was that longing. And before we come to a close, what do you say to those people, and especially parents, who have such guilt about, I could have said, I didn't say, I love you. You know, for me, it was years of awareness that I was honoring Reed. I spoke to him and said, we'll get through this. I don't even know if he heard me, Paula, in the state of shame and upset that he was in. But I didn't take his hand. I didn't say, come with me to see your girlfriend. Well, what do I do now? I'm a somatic therapist. I teach people to listen to their body.
To hold hands.
To hold hands, exactly.
Yeah.
And so what do you say to people who feel guilty?
Yeah. That's the hardest, and especially, I think, for parents, all the what ifs, right? I'll give you my example. I never felt guilty about my father's death. First of all, because I was very close to him, especially the last 2 years of his life. He was going through all those problems. I was trying to help him in every way I could. Took him to, I saw the signs, took him to the doctor. But even then, I didn't feel guilty about his death and the suicide. But the day he died, the day before, I was here in the US on vacation.
Oh.
My sister called me the day before. He died on a Monday, so Sunday night, she was talking to me. And she said, "Oh, Dad is coming up. She's coming. He just called and he's coming up to see us. Do you want to talk to him and wait and talk to him?" And I said, "No, because I was coming home in 3 days." And he always picked me up at the airport. My dad loved going to airports. I don't get it.
Maybe he was an Aquarian. Who knows?
I know.
They
he
love
loved
airplanes.
it. He always picked us up at the airport. So I said, no, I'm going to see him soon. I don't need to talk to him. That was the what if for me. Wow, what if I had talked to him? Maybe I would have picked it up. Because the fact was that he had come to my sisters to say goodbye. And she saw that very clearly. After he left, she called me. So what I have to say, all of that is to say, there will always be questions. There will always be what ifs, and maybes, but like you said, I was listening to you. Said I talked to him. I said we'll go through this, but right, I didn't hold his hand.
Yes.
So you can't do everything. You just can't. And one of the things that I can't, Dr. Jordan. Yeah, Dr. Jordan. So look for that episode if you go to my podcast. James Jordan, I think Dr. Jordan. So it's dealing with blame is the title. But one of the things he told me that was so helpful, because we have to deal in therapy with this guilt, right?
Yes, we do.
He said, Paula, when parents come to me and they say it was my fault, I didn't listen to him. Sometimes they told me they wanted to die, and I said that's just a teenage thing. And how can I live with myself? And he said, you know what? I will go there with you. I will hold your hand. I'll be here with you. We're going to go to that trial. I will sit with you during the trial. The only thing that I ask you is that you are going to be fair. That's the only thing I ask. I'll sit with you through the trial. There will be hard things that maybe we could have done to help, and we may come to that decision, but please just be fair with yourself. You as a parent, remember this. You weren't the parent for just the minutes before they died.
That's
Look
right.
back and remember what kind of parent you were. I'm sure there are so many things to be proud of. So be fair with yourself. That's what I would say.
That's wonderful. And I always say to people, pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Is this guilt causing you suffering?
Yeah.
And so we work out a little system where they can feel guilty for 10 minutes of every hour and then be. And then they can write down or be in that guilt for 5 or 10 minutes of the next hour. So that guilt is really something that's self-inflicted. And I had a man in my office just 2 weeks ago, Paula, and his wife was killed in an accident, a pedestrian accident. And he was, lamenting. He was there as well. And I said, did you wake up that morning intending to kill your wife? And he said, no. And so and immediately you could see his face. All of the guilt drained out. His shoulders went back down to where,
Yeah.
And so it's those things for us again, like you said, as therapists, we are empathetic, we are compassionate, and when we stay present, then there is that opportunity to be with that person. And I love how you listened to my words with the word but. And that's what we do, because our clients always have the answer. It's our job to listen and reflect it back to them, because they don't realize how wise they are. So it has been such an honor to have you here to listen to your wisdom. So is there anything else you'd like to say for our listeners as our time together comes to a close today?
Be good to yourself, because we're here, we have friends, we have connections, we have family, but in the end, you should be your best friend. Really, you should be nice to yourself, compassionate, exercise gratitude. I know we're talking about this so much, but the more I live, the more I realize the importance of being grateful for what you have and not just be wishing you had more. And being aware of that, but be gracious to yourself.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, to each of you today, please comment in the section below any questions that you might have. And we'll make sure that Paula and I get back to you. And check out her course and, of course, her podcast. So those links will be available to each of you. Thank you for your time of joining us today.
Thank you
On this
Georgena.
very, very wonderful day, Paula, and to each of you listeners who said yes to sharing your day with us.
Thank you. You have a good
Welcome.
day.
Bye.